I'm Jay Miller, and today on George Fox Talks, I'm going to be speaking with my colleague Dana Robinson about early Christians and food. It's an intellectual feast. Today we're in the studio with my colleague Dana Robinson. Dana is an assistant professor of history and theology here at George Fox University and is also my colleague in the honors program. So it's great to have Dana on the show to talk about her new book, Food, Virtue, and the Shaping of Early Christianity. When Dana's talking about early Christianity, she's not talking about early Christians we might think about reading about in the New Testament per se, as much as Christianity as it's taking shape in a sort of post-Constantinian sort of world. So 4th century, Constantine has brought about making Christianity the official religion of the empire. Along with that, you have a sort of rise of monasticism as a sort of new attempt at seeking the highest forms of Christian piety, since martyrdom is off the table to a certain extent. And so it's a really interesting generative time. And one of the things Dana's really interested in this period isn't just looking at elite Christian writers, elite monks, elite bishops, but asking what did it mean to be an ordinary Christian in this sort of 4th century Mediterranean sort of world. And Dana, one of the ways you get at that sense of what does it mean to be an ordinary Christian is looking at food. And I just wanted to read a sentence here and have you maybe explain it for us so we know why food's so compelling for you. You say in your book, food is a vehicle of social differentiation, experiment, and controversy. Even more than what you eat, the key to your social and political identity lies in how, where, and with whom you eat. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're getting at in that sentence and why food's so compelling for you to thinking about ordinary early Christians?
Yeah, I think this is something that we all have a kind of innate connection to, right? Because food is probably the most universal thing that there is for human beings, right? We all have to eat to stay alive. Every individual has to eat to stay alive. There's a biological necessity to that. So it's part of the common human experience that we need to do that. But at the same time, food is both intensely personal, right? You have kind of preferences that you develop in childhood, things that you remember, the way that the sensory experience of food is very meaningful to an individual. But we don't, none of us eats food by taking a capsule alone in a phone booth or something, right?
Not yet.
Not yet. And I suspect maybe never, we never really will, because there's something about the experience of eating together, the fact that that cultures do develop different foods that different cultures eat, that the way we have rituals that surround our meal times, that it says something who we choose to eat with, how we choose to do it. So there's something about food that not just kind of defines our identity as individuals, but also kind of creates the kind of communities and sustains the kind of communities that we form in small and in large form. So there's a term in anthropology that I really like that talks about food as embodied material culture. What that means, it's kind of the only thing that's a product of culture, something that we make, but it's made in order to be destroyed and to be destroyed by consuming and absorbing it into our own body. So it gives you this very kind of personal embodied connection with the products of your culture and all kinds of other things. So what this means is when you look at food, you see biological necessity, you can look at agriculture, you look at politics, you look at gender, you look at class, you look at religion, because food crosses into all of those areas of culture because of these very deeply personal and very communal aspects that it has at the same time.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you say in the book that I thought was interesting is that even though broadly you're looking at different sites throughout the Mediterranean world, you do sort of posit that there's a relatively shared Mediterranean food culture. Could you talk about the food culture of the early Christian world you're looking at, and maybe specifically how food is socio-political in that period? What might that look like, the politics of food in the Roman Empire at this time?
Yeah, so first of all, there's the sort of Mediterranean diet is in a sense, there's a very general sense of this where it's dependent on the agriculture of the region, which around the Mediterranean is going to be a lot of grain, wheat, barley, wine. What's the other thing? I'm drawing a blank on the other thing. Anyway, there's 3 things. I can't remember the other one.
Olives?
Olives. There you go. I'm seeing the map in my head of where the line is of the olive, cultivation. So those are kind of commodities. Those are kind of the central commodities. Wheat is almost like the oil of the Roman world. So if you have a wheat shortage somewhere, you have to get it there from somewhere else. And there's kind of an expectation that the government is going to do that. Or is that's part of the responsibility of government to sort of subsidize and provide the grain for people. And there will be riots if it's not provided. And so the sort of food instability is very real for people because of the changing climate and all kinds of other things. So there's a certain amount of food instability and expectation that there's going to be some amount of subsidy being provided. But you also have a world where I think maybe because of food insecurity, on the flip side of that, the conspicuous consumption of food by the wealthy is something that's very, very prominent, maybe even more so than it is today, that one of the ways that the wealthy show their wealth is by dining extravagantly. And there's also a sense for these elite, wealthy Romans, broadly speaking, in the empire, that the way that rich people network with each other is by these dinner parties that they have at home. So there's this idea where if you were rich, you could afford to have like a cook and a fancy dining room, and you could throw dinners at home. Whereas if you were poor and you lived in an apartment tenement building, you didn't necessarily even have your own kitchen. You would eat out at like the tavern on the corner where you could get some lentil stew. So there's a very much this like dining at home and having your kind of political colleagues and the people you wanted to network with dinner at your house was something that was very much the province of the wealthy and very much a kind of political networking environment. Whereas the poor are going to be much more likely to like eat in a tavern.
Yeah. And so this is the world, the social kind of political food culture that early Christians in the 4th century are working in, living in, participating in. And it was interesting when I first started learning about your work, even before I read your book. And once I read the book or started the book, I thought, well, certainly if she's talking about food culture and Christians, surely in this period she's going to be talking about the Eucharist, this kind of ritual Christian meal. And actually you make a point of saying, I'm looking a lot further beyond that. Could you say a little bit why this study didn't take you into maybe looking at the Eucharist as much as the broader food culture and practices of early Christians?
Yeah, that was something that surprised me as well. I thought when I went into this that the Eucharist was going to be much more prominent in sort of the ordinary person's life. And I think this is partly a product of the particular moment in Christian history that I was looking at, because by the time you get to the 4th century, the Eucharist has developed into a liturgical ritual that's not necessarily part of an ordinary meal at home anymore. Right? That development has kind of already happened. And there's actually a sense in which church leaders and priests and bishops are very concerned about protecting the sanctity of the Eucharist and making sure nobody gets it mixed up with an ordinary meal. So they're very concerned about, nobody should be having the Eucharist at home, even though they probably are. It should be this very protected because it's sacred and we want to protect this ritual. And so they make a big point of how it's not like an ordinary meal. It's not like any other ordinary meal that you would have. So what this does in a weird sort of way is that it's detached the Eucharist from all your ordinary meal environments. And what that does, I found, is that it opens up the ordinary meal environment again for new forms of theological reflection and kind of thinking about what does it mean? If it's not what the Eucharist is about, what is it? So that's where I found that the meal practices of Christians and the food practices of Christians outside of the Eucharist were very, very generative for them in terms of community formation and moral formation. That had very little to do with the Eucharist specifically and had much more to do with this common kind of Mediterranean culture of food and moral formation and politics and wealth and the ethics of food and all these kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that's a good opportunity to get into a little bit more concretely what you look at in the book. You have this great sentence that I think relates to what we're saying of, you open by saying, for John Chrysostom, who's a major early Christian thinker, the most important meal in his daily life of his congregation is not the Eucharist, but rather the ordinary domestic supper. Can you tell us a little bit about what your analysis, who Chrysostom is broadly, and then what sort of you find innovative about the way he's talking about food for ordinary Christians?
Yeah, so John John Chrysostom is a priest in the city of Antioch, which was part of Syria at that time, is now actually part of Turkey, where it was the third biggest city in the Roman Empire. And he was a priest there. He was later the Bishop of Constantinople, and he's famous for his sermons. We have hundreds of his sermons that survive. He was a great kind of biblical expository preacher as well as a kind of a moral preacher.
Golden Mouth is one of his nicknames,
yes.
Is that right?
Yes, because he was such a great preacher and orator. So we have hundreds of his sermons, which are a really great resource for trying to learn about ordinary Christians, because they're still coming from the perspective of an educated, relatively wealthy person, but he's speaking to a congregation, right, and kind of saying things to them that he thinks they need to hear. So there's a lot of really interesting details in his sermons about social life, the social life in Antioch. So he's very, very concerned across the board with the sort of daily habits and daily practices of people in his congregation. He wants them to have every aspect of their life reflect their Christian identity. So he pays a lot of attention to what they're doing all the time, and meals are a big part of that. And because I think a lot of the times he is preaching to a wealthier audience, and he spends a lot of time giving them instructions about like what you should do when you have a dinner party. He's really concerned about this excessive spending, about this kind of conspicuous consumption. You shouldn't be spending all this money on your dinner party. You should be spending it. You should be giving it to the poor, for instance. But when he does that, it's a little bit less about. I don't know, it's a little bit more radical, I think, than it would be to a modern Christian to say, you should invite the poor to your dinner party or something like this. Because in this world, this is really where the political elites interact with each other, is at these domestic banquets. So to say you shouldn't invite people you want to impress, you should invite the poor, is really kind of radically upsetting this, I guess, political and social world that his rich congregants are participating in.
Yeah, it seems to me that kind of touches on a bigger question you're looking at your study, is as Christianity is becoming more mainstream, more established in a certain way, more official, it seems like one of the things you're really interested in is to what extent it's appropriating and taking on this kind of already established, pre-existing sort of Roman pagan culture, however we want to think about it. To what extent is it taking that on, or to what extent is it sort of pushing that away and distinguishing itself? So different examples in your book do different things. Would you say for Chrysostom that he's a thinker who's trying to draw firmer distinctions between Christian food culture and Roman food culture?
I think he is. Because he's trying to say that Christians are going to hold their banquets in radically different ways. But I think on another level, he isn't, because he's still accepting this idea that the meal is a sort of social performance. He's just saying the kind of social performance you should be having there is one where you're performing true virtue by not just trying to impress, but trying to have real kind of meaningful relationships with the people who are there. Instead of having secular entertainers, you should, read the Bible at your dinner party, this kind of thing. So it still depends on the kind of the structure of the dinner party. He just wants to kind of shift around the players a little bit.
Yeah. And I don't think you get this in the book, but it's a question I have. Are you able, well, maybe you do get at it. You have a case study of like one wealthy person. We kind of have a case study of how Chrysostom might have been thinking concretely about how the rich should dine. But do we have a sense at all of how Chrysostom's audience might have received his teaching and put that into practice? Or is that just kind of inaccessible to us so many centuries removed?
It's very hard to, because it's kind of a one-sided conversation, right? We have all the things that he says.
Yeah.
And we don't really have anything that his audience wrote.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is helpful to get at that is to sometimes think about the metaphors that he uses in the sermons. Because metaphors are the kind of thing that aren't just kind of linguistic decorations. They actually structure the way we think about things by saying that we understand one thing in terms of another thing. And there has to be a kind of shared common understanding in order for that to make sense. So, for instance, when this is going away from the dining rooms a little bit, but when Chrysostom talks a lot about moderation and uses metaphors regarding health, there's this idea that health requires a balance of the humors in your body, and it depends on eating the right things.
Yeah.
right? Not eating too much, not eating too little. That's going to be very personalized to the individual. But there's a sense where you have to have a kind of shared understanding of what that means. And so we can kind of speculate a little bit about how those metaphors would have landed for people who had this certain kind of mindset of understanding what medicine was like, or what dining practices were like.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about John Chrysostom and his desire to delineate carefully, even if he doesn't have control over his parish, between the Roman food culture and what Christian food culture looks like. You talk about another early Christian writer in your study named Paulinus, who is a little more creative, I think it's fair to say, in his use of language around food culture. Could you tell us more about who Paulinus was and what about his rhetoric has been helpful for you in thinking about the questions you're interested in?
Yeah, Paulinus was one of these super rich people in the late Roman Empire who got kind of renowned. He was kind of a celebrity convert for Christianity because he decided to renounce all of his wealth, which was a lot. So he got a lot of attention for deciding to devote himself to a more ascetic form of Christianity. He gave up all his wealth, and he also felt a very deep connection to a saint named Felix who had been martyred in the 3rd century, I think.
Did you say where this was?
He's in Italy. Yeah,
Italy,
so he's like
okay.
south of Rome. I think he's from Gaul originally, but this is south of Rome, where he's located in Italy.
Okay.
And so he devotes the rest of his life to the shrine of Felix and to sort of promoting the veneration of Felix at this shrine in the Roman Italian countryside. And what that means is he kind of lives an ascetic life there, and every year there's a festival on Felix's martyrdom, or his day of his death, which is celebrated as his day, where people come to this festival from all over the place to remember Felix and venerate him. And Paulinus, who's also very, very highly educated, writes poetry. Every year he writes this public poetry to be sort of declaimed on the day of Felix's festival in honor of Felix. He does this for like 15 years.
Wow. Do we have all of his poems for that? Wow.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting. They're not sermons, but they're sort of public poems because he writes them in the very kind of highfalutin late Roman style, but a little bit dumbed down for a popular audience, right, to be able to listen to. So he gives all these poems every year, and a lot of them have, as part of the poem, he tells a story about somebody who had an interaction with Felix that gives some kind of honor to the saint, and then through the saint to God. And so he tells there's these great stories. And so one of my favorite ones that he tells is a story about a guy who lives in the countryside, just an ordinary guy who he's in trouble. I can't remember why, but for some reason he decides he wants to thank Felix for something that Felix did for him. And so he makes a vow that he's going to bring a pig and sacrifice it to Felix. On Felix, or sacrifice it to Felix at the shrine on Felix's day. And then he comes and he sacrifices it, and he kills it at the shrine, and he gives a little bit of the meat, and then he packs up all the rest of the meat and goes home. But he doesn't get more than a couple miles away before he freezes in some kind of weird paralysis and falls off this is all the story that he's telling, right? He falls off his donkey and he can't move, and he's like, what happened? And then he realized what had happened was that he did his sacrifice wrong. He wasn't supposed to take any of the meat home. So he goes back to the shrine of Felix and is like, oh, I realized I'm supposed to give all the meat to feed the poor here. And then I can go. And then Felix frees him from his paralysis, and he goes on. And there's a couple of more stories along those lines. Yeah. Which are they're funny. I mean, they're really funny stories. One of them literally involves a flying pig, and these kinds of things. But the interesting thing about it, when I first read that, what startled me about that is I think we're accustomed to think about sacrifice as being the one practice that Christians don't do, right? That's the one that they kind of define themselves against the most.
Yeah, as opposed
strictly,
to
right? We don't
Roman
do
culture,
Romans,
not just Romans, but also
Jews.
Yes, yeah.
Offering animal sacrifices, and they're like, no, Christians don't do animal sacrifices. And this seems to complicate that in an interesting way. Yeah. That he seems to be describing something that looks an awful lot like animal sacrifices. Yeah. And the idea that you have to do it correctly and you have to do this whole thing.
And not just describing it, but celebrating it in this kind of huge public poem.
Right. Which suggests a couple of really interesting things. First of all, suggests that ordinary people in the Italian countryside still don't think of this as incompatible with Christianity, right? That they could, these are the kinds of traditional practices that people have been doing since time immemorial, I guess, right? That you have this kind of relationship with a divine being where if they help you, you make a promise that you're going to give them something, they help you, you give them the gift in gratitude, and this kind of reciprocal exchange relationship continues. And that seems to be the sort of thing that's continuing with Christians. And then for Paulinus to write this poem about it and be like, yeah, there's a sense in which there's space in Christianity for this. He doesn't seem anxious about it at all, right? I mean, arguably part of the thing that makes it okay is that it's not, well, it is. I was about to say it's not a sacrifice, but it is, because he brings it, he kills it ritually in front of the door, right? As a vow, as the fulfillment of a vow to Felix. But the thing that makes it okay, apparently, is that you're feeding the meat to the poor. So, and Augustine says a few things along this line too. Like, it's okay to have these kinds of like ritual meals as long as you're feeding the poor with it and not just like feasting.
Yeah, there's kind of like an ethical legitimation. Or the end or the purpose of it is what legitimates it or makes it acceptable.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. And Paulinus might be a little bit of an outlier in his kind of comfort level with that. With that practice, but it certainly suggests that there's a lot of space for Christians to be kind of engaging in traditional practices, but just kind of redirecting them towards God and towards the saints.
Yeah, you mentioned sacrifice a little bit in talking about Paulinus, and it's a big issue in this period in your own study. Could you unpack that a little bit more, why sacrifice is so significant and how you're maybe in this study trying to shift the way we think about sacrifice for early Christians in relationship to the Roman Empire?
Yeah, I think this is part of, the way that we tend ordinarily to think about sacrifice, and this is the product of sort of religious studies of the 19th century, thinking about it. And there was this strong kind of emphasis in religious studies at that time to think about what's important about sacrifice is that it's bloodshed, right? And there's all these different theories about, it's abstract, it's ritual violence, or it's creating a scapegoat, or it's a kind of blood has to be shed in order for atonement to be possible. All these kinds of theological readings of sacrifice. And what I'm finding, and what some more current studies on Roman religion in particular is suggesting, is that might be a little bit of an over-reading of the significance of blood sacrifice. That in fact the kind of system, what we could call the system of sacrifice, was really a much broader system of sort of gift exchange between people and the gods. That you're kind of like,
that's what you call votive religion.
Yeah, exactly. It's the idea that which comes from the word for vows.
Okay,
right? So it's the idea of like, the gods do something for you, you promise to do something for them, they do something for you. It's just kind of like a relationship based on exchange, which I think we tend to think of as transactional in a negative way. But if you think of any other kind of social interactions or social relationships that you have, there's a certain kind of expectation of reciprocity, right? Like your grandmother gives you a present, so you send her a thank you note, right? And that's not like, that's not negative. That's just the way relationships work.
Right.
So there's a sense where we should actually be thinking about Roman religion and sacrifice in that much broader context. And that makes a lot more sense of what we see people doing. And it kind of makes the blood sacrifice part a little bit less significant and a little less prominent. And I found that actually helps with understanding a lot of what's going on in early Christianity too. That there's this whole idea that the way you relate to divine beings is through a system of social exchange. And you do for divine beings anything that you would do for a person that you have a relationship with. And you could call some of that sacrifice, but you don't have to. And so there's a whole broad range of practices that are open for, I think you use the word assimilation, or for creative repurposing that people are doing. And if we're too narrowly focused on like sacrifice as bloodshed or on what's Christian versus what's pagan, we kind of miss out on the kind of creative assimilation that's happening.
Yeah, or if we're only focused on the Eucharistic ritual. I think a word you also use in the study is like the diffusion of sort of Christian piety out beyond just like the liturgical piety, but the broader sort of maybe more votive pieties you're picking up on. Could you just say really quickly, we don't have to get in depth, but like what are some examples of early Christian sort of votive kind of practices that are more about that reciprocality and giving and less about the sacrifice?
Well, there are a lot of objects, like we'll find objects at churches and at shrines, which also is a continuation of a traditional practice where maybe a little like a little plaque with some eyes on it, and then thank you God for helping me kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you would bring that and you would give it at the shrine, or you would I'm trying to think of something else. A lot of that kind of thing, small objects that could be offered. You might light a lamp at your doorway at nighttime.
Yeah.
You might before a meal, you might actually do something like pouring out a little bit of the wine or something like that, which wouldn't be Eucharistic, but would be a kind of like thanks offering.
Sure.
Those are the examples that come to mind off the top of my head.
Yeah, those all make sense. And it reminds me of a beautiful sentence you close your analysis of Paulinus with. You say, Christian sacrifice is not just death, martyrdom, and ascetic renunciation. It's also a joyful crowd, tears of repentance, kisses of supplication, a candle, a garland, a beloved farm animal, a votive graffito, a poem, a meal. And this quote raises for me a question that I've just started to think about as we're talking, actually, of to what extent are the practices of the early Christians you're looking at around food reminiscent of an ancient sort of Roman culture? Or to what extent are they more kind of looking forward to what we think of as this medieval piety that's very much about devotion, reverence, almost semi-enchanted sort of objects? It's sort of a question of periodization. I wonder if you could talk with us about to what extent is what you're looking at ancient versus to what extent is it looking forward to the medieval period?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think what is the most interesting to me about this period, the kind of 4th, 5th century, is that's when that moment is happening, right? That's when we're kind of starting to see that transition from what in the 4th century is really still very much an ancient and Roman world, but there's enough change happening that's going to start moving in the direction of the Middle Ages. I think for me, there's a sense in the 4th century still of creativity. Not that there isn't in the medieval period. I don't want the medievalists to hate me, but every period has its own creativity. But I think there's still something for me very powerful in the 4th, 5th century. That there's been a lot of standardization in sort of institutional Christianity, but it's not all the way there.
Yeah.
There's still a kind of sense that we're making it up, and that what ordinary people do is still going to play into that to some extent. And that kind of creative repurposing of traditions is still very much in play. And I think it's always in play, right? There's always some distance between what the institutional church is saying and what people do in their life. And I think one thing I've been pushing back against a little bit is the sense that one of those is more Christian than the other. I think what people do in their understanding of Christianity is just as important as what theologians say, and that the interchange between those two things is what pushes Christianity to develop in the ways that it does.
Periodization questions are always kind of more like thought experiments than actual, like, is this medieval or is this ancient? But I think it makes sense what you're saying of what's compelling about this period is that something of a hinge, right? And in those kind of hinge or transitional periods of history, you do maybe have a certain kind of creativity where, the kind of old forms are still existence and the new ones haven't quite locked into place or sort of congealed. This isn't what you're interested in is not just recovering though beautiful practices, nice little pieties, but you're also interested in ethics and politics. So I'm just curious, what are the broader takeaways for you in terms of ethics and politics of food from your study, and maybe how does that make you think about these sort of questions today, even though we're so far removed from kind of like the Roman Empire?
Yeah, I as a historian, I'm sort of allergic to people trying to make comparisons to ancient Rome because it's usually not very helpful. But a couple of areas where I do find myself going back to again and again as I try to think about what does it mean to live a sort of life of ethical interaction with food and with other people today, I think one of the things where the late Roman world is really similar to ours is in the wealth gap. There's that very kind of, there's the very rich and there's everybody else, and there's an increasing gap between those things. And that's definitely true in the late Roman world. And we see Christians thinking about that a lot, being very concerned about that. And so I think part of what, like, for instance, Chrysostom is getting at with the dining room stuff is that you shouldn't be, if you are one of these wealthier people, you shouldn't be isolating yourself in a world of other wealthier people. You know, you should be thinking about, maybe you need to give away all your wealth. Maybe you need to not just, I don't think about it so much as giving away all my wealth because I'm not in the 1%, but I still have enough I could think about. You know, I have enough to make me uncomfortable with having it. And so I tend to think about that. And one thing I think is really concrete about that is, do we only dine with people who are like us? Like, we don't have the same kind of political environment where for most of us our dinner parties are about political schmoozing.
Right.
But there's still a sense where we have parties with people that we want to impress and people who are like us. And so I'm like, to what extent do you have to work kind of hard to get outside your bubble and associate with people who aren't like you. That's one area that I feel really challenged from some of this work. And that a lot of that it takes place around food, right? The people you eat with says something important about who your people are, right? The other thing I think a lot about is kind of in terms of conspicuous consumption. And that looks different now, but I think about even a lot of the conversation about the ethics of food, right, is about sourcing and ethical food production, and are we buying the meat that's been ethically produced and all of this kind of thing. And I think that that's important, but I've become increasingly concerned that in itself is another form of conspicuous consumption, because that kind of meat is so expensive, because it takes so much kind of effort and expenditure to eat that way. And I understand that I'm concerned about the environmental elements of it, of course, but I think I'm also concerned about the extent to which that's still something that's only within the reach of the reasonably wealthy. And so I wonder sometimes if there wouldn't be more, or another way to think about a Christian ethics of food would be trying to eat in a way that would be more in solidarity with the poor. Like, maybe I need to just eat the way the poor eat in order to have more to give, or something like this, that I don't need to be isolating myself with these kinds of very expensive practices, if that makes sense.
For sure, yeah. I think it's totally valid to kind of look at how going to a farmer's market and buying your organic food and dropping it in a chic tote bag and walking home is kind of more of a consumer choice than something that's actually reconfiguring our political system and our whole political economy around food. And I also think it's worth asking, even though I myself has been influenced by a lot of kind of local sustainable food kind of thinking, but I think there's a lot to be said for, we have a huge population on Earth, and we need to think about like producing food for the masses, and I kind of, in some ways that takes me back to your study, because you're interested very much in like, what's piety and what's eating look like for the masses and not just for the elite. And I think you capture really well how, even though it's filtered through an elite lens, just how, kind of elite Christians themselves are having to think about that problem of not everyone's going to become a monk or some other hyper ascetic kind of role. So thank you so much for taking us into that world and having us look at it through food and ordinariness and the lives with lay Christians.
Thank you.
This video podcast is a production of George Fox Digital. To find more material like this, you can subscribe to George Fox Talks on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Our team really appreciates your feedback in the form of likes, comments, and reviews, and we'd really love to hear what you think. To sign up for our weekly email list and to keep up to date with the latest episodes and publications, you can check us out on the web at georgefox.edu/talks. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.